Hey everyone, good afternoon. This is your Chapter 1 video lecture. The name of the chapter is Fundamental Concepts, and really we're talking about fundamental concepts of motor development. Before we get started, I just wanted to remind you of some upcoming assignments. Your syllabus assignment is due tonight, which is Friday, the 24th of August, and your student video introduction is due on Sunday. Remember, both of those assignments are an opportunity to ensure that we can proceed with the course. The syllabus assignment, I'll ask a bunch of questions regarding the syllabus, and really I use it to serve as documentation purposes, so that whenever there's issues, if there's ever an issue that arises throughout the semester, I can always say, well, you completed the syllabus assignment, so you knew or you should have been aware of that policy. The student video introduction is an opportunity for you to introduce yourself to your classmates and to me, but it also serves as a way for me to know that you can use the electronic equipment in order to complete your additional homework assignments later on this semester. All right, so please get those in by the due date so that I can start looking at them, reviewing them, and grading them, and start updating the gradebook. All right. Okay, so this is motor development. So, with the name of this course, motor development, I asked the question, are we developing a motor? And it seems like a comical question, because you can see the pictures of these motors, and I don't know if these are motors or an engine, and quite frankly, I don't even know the difference between a motor and an engine. But I do know that it's mechanical, or it's part of any mechanical system, whether it's an automobile or a generator or pumps or whatever it is that they're used for. But the idea again is going back to the name of the course, motor development. So in order to understand whether or not we're actually building a motor, we have to start understanding some of the underlying concepts of the human body. One of those being the nervous system. Now, we're not going to go into an extensive review of the nervous system, but I want you to understand at least the basics and understand how the nervous system is responsible for creating human movement, which is what we do as kinesiologists. The basic breakdown of the nervous system is two components: the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is composed of the brain and spinal cord. Seems very simple, but I assure you it's probably the most complex system of the nervous system. The brain itself takes years of graduate study to really start to develop an understanding of what's going on with the brain and how it works. But in a general perspective, the brain generates messages, creates the information, it creates the instructions for what the body should do. So in relation to human movement, the body doesn't move unless the brain tells it to do so. Bottom line. We know that the muscles and bones are associated with movement, but in all actuality, if the brain either doesn't create the message to tell the muscles to contract, or the message is unable to be delivered to the muscles won't work. Okay? So the brain is the processing center of the body. The spinal cord is just a highway system. All right, so when you look at the picture here, the brain is here, and the spinal cord runs down through the vertebral column of the body. It's just a highway system. No messages are generated in the spinal cord. It's just that the messages that are generated in the brain are delivered to the body via the highway that we call the spinal cord. Okay, so that's the central nervous system. If anything happens to the brain or spinal cord, it really produces debilitating results to the human body. It really prevents or eliminates the ability to move, especially if the particular portion of the spinal cord or brain is responsible for movement to particular parts of the body. All right, the peripheral nervous system is pretty much the nervous system that branches away from the brain and spinal cord. Now, there's a couple of cranial nerves. I believe there's 12 pairs of cranial nerves that are responsible for movement in the face and the head. but every other nerve is branches away from the spinal cord. Okay, so each of these nerves are responsible for a particular muscle system or a muscle group or a particular muscle or even a part of a muscle. Okay, so when you look at the yellow pathways, these are the nerves. So, for example, the nerve here, and I can't remember the names, and I'm not going to ask you to memorize the names in this particular course. I mean, a lot of you guys have just taken A&P, so perhaps you learned the names of all the nerves in that course. But the nerves that are responsible for, let's say, the thumbs up, that would run all the way to the muscles responsible for, that'd be the extension of the thumb. We'll talk about movement later on in the semester. But if that particular nerve is ever altered or injured or severed, then we lose the ability to move that particular muscle. It doesn't render you paralyzed, or it doesn't affect the way you walk or the way you run. It just means that you can't give up, give the thumbs up sign. All right, so those are the peripheral nerves. Now there's two different systems that are associated with the peripheral nervous system. You have the somatic nervous system, which is what I'm referring to, the nerves that are responsible for voluntary activity. And that's what a muscle contraction is. It's a voluntary contraction. It's something that we have to create. We have to generate. The autonomic nervous system is responsible for all involuntary activities, stuff that are the parts of the body that we don't have control over, like the heart rate or digestion or glandular secretions. We can't just on demand tell those processes to work or those systems to work. It requires the brain delivering it whenever it feels like it needs to, or whenever there's whenever it's stimulated to do so. Okay, so for this class, we're going to focus in just on the somatic nervous system, and really when we start to understand when we start to look at this particular system, we start to understand why this course is named the way it is in motor development. The word motor is in reference to the particular nerves that are associated with the somatic nervous system. You have two types of nerves. You have afferent nerves. These are also known as sensory nerves. These are the nerves that are responsible for detecting stimuli, especially at the from the environment, from the external environment. So like if you're hot or you feel hot or you touch a hot object, those nerves will send a message back to the brain. So they arrive to the brain. That's how I remember afferent. It starts with the letter A. Arrive to the brain starts with the letter A. Afferent, arrive. The afferent messages arrive to the brain. Okay. These nerves are also associated with the joints. So if a joint is stretched beyond its normal range of motion, it'll tell the brain that it's, hey, we're at risk for serious injury if you don't stop what's going on right at this particular moment where the joint is being displaced beyond normal or anatomical position. The efferent nerves, these are also called motor nerves. Okay, so that's where we get the term motor. Efferent nerves are the nerves that send messages from the brain to the muscles. Okay, so without that message, without that pathway, the muscles don't know to contract. And in order for us to move, movement is attributed to a combination of muscles moving in unison in order for an entire movement to occur. Okay, so the nerves that are associated with movement are the motor nerves or the efferent nerves. But the word motor, that's where we get motor development. Okay, so when we look at when we think about motor development, okay, so what we're really thinking about, or what we're really starting to develop an understanding, especially in this course, is how the nerves and how the brain, why the brain generates messages, and how and what's going on with that generation of messages in order to send impulses to particular muscle groups that are associated with movement. Okay, and we start off looking at, even going into development in the fetal stages of life before birth. And then we go into, after birth, the babies are infants. They don't have a lot of control of their muscles. They obviously can't move the way that you and I can. And we experienced all that, although we don't remember it. I mean, it was only within the first year of our life, and we don't remember that far back. But eventually, something starts to happen. Things start to happen where we're allowed to, move on command. We're able to turn around, turn our body, flip our body from the back to the stomach. We're able to lift ourselves into a crawl position. We're able to pick ourselves up to a standing position. We're able to start to walk with assistance. And then eventually we're able to walk unassistedly. And then we're able to run. And then we're able to jump. Okay, there's lots of things that have to happen in our body that will allow us to do all these movements, and then to get into more specific movements. Movements that are unique to to each individual. Like, for example, I played baseball, and just due to constant repetition and training, I was able to develop a very proficient baseball swing, whereas somebody who doesn't train like I did, or doesn't, engage in that particular activity like I did, on a frequent and a constant basis, they won't develop the swing that I developed, and that's the same for anyone else who's involved in a particular sport or an activity. Those of you who are engaged in a particular movement more so than others will become more proficient, whereas the others will always remain at a beginner level. Okay, so there's lots of things that have to happen in order to do that, but one of the things is the firing rate of the impulses that are responsible for innervating the muscles that are responsible for that movement. Okay, so for example, if your body starts to realize, oh well, this is a soccer player and they're used to dribbling, so in order for them to become more proficient, more coordinated, we're just going to go ahead and start firing impulses to those muscles at a much more frequent rate, so that whenever it's time to move, those impulses are already in place. That system's already in place. Whereas if you're taking somebody who's dribbling a soccer ball for the very first time, they don't have that fire rate, and therefore they don't have the coordination, they don't have the proficiency, and they look like a beginner. Stages. So movement is still in stages. It's not a coordinated movement. Okay, so even at the deepest level, it's the impulse of the nervous system interacting or innervating the muscles at a quick firing rate, and we'll talk more about that later on the semester. That allows the movement to become more fluid, more coordinated, and you guys have all experienced that in some capacity. Whether it's, if you remember the way that you started writing in cursive whenever you're in second or third grade, to the point where, you've established your own handwriting, and it's very unique because the muscles in your particular body are trained a little bit different than everyone else on Earth. All right, so that's why you start to develop some unique characteristics, even though you're engaged in a movement that everybody else can do. It's just that there's those minute differences. And a lot of it has to do with the nervous system. So it actually becomes pretty interesting, and that's why it also becomes complicated, which is why it takes so long to study. But in this course, we're just going to go do an overview of the nervous system. Here's the basic unit of a nervous system. This is a neuron. It starts off with the dendrites on the left side. It has a cell body, and then an axon, and then you have the synaptic terminals at the end. That's on the right side. All right, so the dendrites receive messages from either the brain itself or from a previous nerve. It could be from the spinal cord. It could be from a previous nerve. But either way, it receives messages and it sends those messages. So you can see how it's like a web-like structure. It kind of captures it. It's an opportunity to capture as much as it can, and it sends those impulses to the cell body where it's processed in the nucleus. Okay, so these messages are chemical in nature. The chemicals are known as neurotransmitters: acetylcholine, dopamine, serotonin. All of these are different types of neurotransmitters. I forget how many types of neurotransmitters there are, but these messages, these impulses, you know what? Let me take a step back. In order to transfer from one nerve to another, or from the brain to another, that's whenever the brain or the nerve, the previous nerve, has to send a neurotransmitter so that the dendrites can be activated. So once the dendrites are activated, it then creates an action potential when sodium and potassium and chloride, they start, you know, doing some weird stuff. And you've studied it. We're not going to, you know, really talk about it in this class, but it creates an electrical impulse. So it goes from a chemical to an electrical impulse. But nonetheless, it gets sent to the nerve, the cell body, where it's processed by the nucleus, and then the nucleus tells the nerve, okay, send the message down the axon to the synaptic terminals, and this is where this particular neuron's neurotransmitters are located. So whenever the electrical message arrives at the synaptic terminals, then the nerve then releases a neurotransmitter. So like I said, acetylcholine or serotonin, dopamine, you know, those types of neurotransmitters. Here are some more pictures of a neuron. Again, you have the dendrites, you have the cell body, the axon, and then you have the synaptic terminals, which you can't see here, but you know that's where the message heads down. This layer around the nerves, those are known as the myelinated sheath. And all that does is just allows the message to go faster. You can see another picture of a dendron, an axon here with the dendrites, the cell body with the nucleus, the axon, and then you have the synaptic terminals, and then here you have a postsynaptic cell. Now that postsynaptic cell can be anything. It could be a muscle, it can be a gland, it could be another neuron. So it can be anything. Okay, and you can see here some examples here. So if this was a neuron, all it's doing is just sending a message to the next neuron so it can keep delivering the message. If the endpoint or the postsynaptic cell is a muscle, obviously the muscle will contract, and we'll talk about how that happens in a second. But if the postsynaptic cell is a gland, then the nerve is telling the gland to start either producing or secreting a hormone, which we'll discuss briefly later on this semester. We talk about the endocrine system. Okay, so here's a microscopic version of or visual of what's going on at the postsynaptic, at the synaptic cleft, or the synaptic terminal. Okay, so this is the end of the neuron. All right, so the electrical message has arrived at the end, and you can see there's a space between the synaptic terminal and the postsynaptic cell. So in this case, it's a muscle. Okay, so there's a space there. All right, so the nerves aren't directly attached to the muscle or the postsynaptic membrane, whatever it is. Okay, there's a space there. That space is called the synaptic cleft. Okay, so there's a space there, and that's why these neurotransmitters have to be released from the synaptic terminal. It goes into all this, and in this case, the ACH stands for acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is being released into the synaptic terminal, and it has to arrive or be received by the postsynaptic membrane. Okay, so in this case, it's the acetylcholine receptors. Okay, so whenever the acetylcholine receptors on this particular muscle receive acetylcholine, it then activates the muscle to generate an electrical impulse or an action potential. And again, it has to do with the exchange of sodium and potassium ions. So, and we'll talk about that later on, but you'll also learn a lot about that in other classes. But that electrical impulse then propagates down what's called the T-tubule, and then the T2. So whenever the message arrives at the T-tubule, at the sarcoplasmic reticulum, this is where calcium is stored. Okay, so the sarcoplasmic reticulum then starts to release calcium ions into the muscle. Okay, and these calcium ions are important because if you look at this picture, well, let me show you this picture, and I'll come back to this. All right, so this right here, let me see. Okay, let's kind of break down the musculature first, starting with the overall muscle, the overall belly of the muscle, and how it's comprised of several, and you can see all these circles here. These are called fascicles, or fascicles, or fascia, I should say. There's another term for it, fascia or fascicles. Okay. Each of those fascicles is comprised of several of these circles. These are the muscle fibers. So there's several muscle fibers inside a fascia, and there's several fascia inside of a muscle. All right. Now, the muscle fiber is starting to become more and more microscopic. The fascia, you can see, like if you cut steak or if you cut chicken or if you cook pork, whenever it shreds, all those thin shreds, that's the fascia. All right, we can see that. And then the fibers, they become more and more microscopic. And then, eventually when we get to the end point, which are the myofilaments, this is actin, the thin myofilament, and then myosin, which is the thick myofilament. We can't see that. That's microscopic in nature. Okay. But that's the breakdown of the muscle, and you can kind of see how that goes. You can review that on your own. But going back to this slide, so this is the myosin, and this is the actin. Okay, so it just changes colors. So going back to what I was talking about, here's the actin, the thin filaments, and myosin, the thick filaments. Going back to this picture, myosin, the thick filament, actin, the thin filaments. All right, this is where muscle contractions occur. Okay, in order for a muscle a contraction to occur, the heads, all these heads on the myosin thick filament on myosin has to attach to the binding sites on actin. Okay, so they bind and then they cock, and whenever they cock, they're pulling all of the muscle, the ends of the muscle, towards the beginning of the muscle. Okay, so we call the beginning and end of the muscle the origin and the insertion. The origin is where the muscle attaches or muscle begins, and the insertion is when the muscle ends. So every muscle has two attachment points, and we call these skeletal muscles because those attachment points occur at the bones. So every muscle has two attachment points to the bones. Okay, or at least two. Some muscles have multiple, but at least two. Where the muscle begins is known as the origin. Where the muscle ends is known as the insertion. Okay, so throughout the muscle, from the beginning to the end, the muscle contains this millions and millions and billions and billions and trillions of these myosin and actin myofilaments. And in order for the muscle to contract, each one of the myosin has to attach to actin, and then all of them together start pulling the end of the muscle towards the beginning. So they start pulling the insertion towards the origin. We call that the action. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But for now, I just wanted you guys get the understanding of the terminology. Now, going back to the actin myosin interaction. Okay, so what we have here, this is a blown up graphic representation of the actin, the actin myofilaments, the thin filaments. Okay, and you can see all these circles here. These are the binding sites on actin. This is where myosin has to attach. But you see this rope-like structure. Okay, and you see on this picture, you see how the rope-like structure, this is known as tropomyosin. Okay, so it's easy to remember because myosin is what's supposed to bind to actin in order for the muscle to contract. Well, the tropomyosin, between contractions, blocks the actin binding sites. This is a system that prevents contraction when the muscle doesn't need to contract, when we're at relaxation. All right, because imagine if we didn't have this system, our muscles could accidentally contract and we'd just be in permanent state of contraction. Okay, so if we don't need to contract, this tropomyosin serves as a protection really to allow us to relax. Okay, but in order for a muscle to contract, this tropomyosin has to be released from the actin binding sites. So in order for that to happen, the calcium ions that are released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum has to bind to the calcium receptor. The calcium receptors on the tropomyosin, and you can see here's how the calcium has bound to the calcium receptor on tropomyosin. Whenever the calcium binds to tropomyosin, it moves or shifts tropomyosin off of the actin binding sites. Now these actin binding sites are exposed to myosin. Okay, so after the myosin, so therefore myosin can now attach to actin, and which causes the muscle to contract. Okay, so this doesn't occur. This does not occur if the chemical message or the nerve or the muscle is not innervated by the nerve. If for whatever reason the nerve is severed or injured or detached or cut or whatever, that message cannot be sent to the muscle, and therefore the muscle never knows to secrete or to release calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And therefore, if no calcium is sent to the sarcoplasmic, is released by the sarcoplasmic reticulum, then this tropomyosin never receives calcium and will always remain attached to the actin binding sites, thus preventing myosin from attaching to actin. And if myosin can't attach to actin, then the muscle just can't contract. The muscle can't pull the insertion towards the origin. And if the muscle, if the action of the muscle doesn't occur, then the muscle can't move the bones, and we can't produce movement. So the nervous system is important. So that's why this course is called motor development. So going back to the question, so are we developing a motor? And I know that now you probably know, well, not really. But if you really look at it, let's look at the definition of a motor. It's a machine, especially one powered by electricity or internal combustion, that supplies motive power for a vehicle or for some other device with moving parts. Wow, sounds like a complicated definition. We'll look real briefly at the second one. A machine that converts electrical energy into mechanical energy. All right, so let's start. Let's think about it. Is there electricity going on in this system in order for us to move? Yeah, it's the nervous system. The nervous system is delivering electrical impulses to the muscles in order for the muscles to function, to move. So there's electrical energy and there's mechanical energy. All right, looking at the first definition, a machine, especially one powered by electricity or internal combustion. Well, is our body a machine? Well, not with like metal parts and and like artificial components, but it is powered by electricity, and that electricity powers the vehicle, and that's general gross movement or some other device with moving parts. I mean, we do have a lot of moving parts, so I mean, it's not a motor like you would be building in like an engineering class, but we are working with a motor in the sense that we can call the human body a motor. I mean, we have electricity, we have fuel, we have mechanical parts. I mean, there's a lot going on, so something to think about, I guess. But let's go into some of the textbook terminology of what the name of the course really means from the textbook's perspective. The definition of motor development, according to the textbook, is the developmental changes in movements and the factors underlying those movements. And that's all we're going to study this semester. We're going to look at, general movement. I mean, everybody has the ability to walk and stand and run and jump. And we're going to look at, how those processes are developed. I mean, we just don't come out into this world and just start walking. I mean, there's certain processes that have to occur, and a lot of that has to deal with milestones and benchmarks. And we'll start to study and examine those and start to understand some of the normal processes and some of the deficiencies. Okay. It's a continuous process. It is age-related in the sense that, these milestones should be reached at a time range. Not everybody's going to, achieve these milestones at the same time. But, typical human development posits that, these milestones will occur, between 8 to 10 months or, 2 to 3 years. Something like that, in the sense that, in order for them to continue to develop, they have to reach these milestones, or else they're not allowed to continue developing. And if that's the case, then we'll be able to start to identify possibility of some adverse defects, or some kind of congenital condition that people are born with, or whatever. Okay, so this is a step-by-step process. It has to happen in unison, in order. So motor development is in reference to basic movements, starting with spontaneous arm movements or leg movements, to being able to engage in activity that every human being can achieve, in terms of walking and standing and running, jumping. Motor learning, just like you learning concepts, you whenever you learn, you have to be exposed or introduced to concepts, and then you kind of have to go over it a couple of times. You have to memorize, study, understand, process, and eventually you just become familiar. You just know the terminology that once you didn't know. Well, that's what motor learning is. Motor learning is, how does our body learn how to develop particular movements? And it has to happen by the same process. It has to be kind of introduced or exposed, and there has to be some type of training system or process to the point where the body then becomes familiar or efficient at performing that behavior or that movement that once wasn't possible. Like, for example, walking. I mean, you and I, we walk and we take it for granted now, but there was a time in our life that we weren't allowed to walk. We didn't have the opportunity. We didn't have the capacity to walk. We had to learn. Our body had to learn how to walk, and that's what motor learning is talking about. So motor development, basic movements. Motor learning is starting to understand how to engage and how in particular movements, and how to go from beginning to proficient. Okay. I'm sorry. Motor behavior is just a simple combination of the development and learning. So pretty much a combination of the first two terms. But motor control is the nervous system's control of muscles that permit skilled and coordinated movement. That's what I was referring to earlier. You take someone who's proficient at a particular movement. There's a reason why they look so smooth. They look so coordinated. Whereas you take somebody else who's never done this activity before, they're more jerky. They're more awkward looking. And we've all experienced it. And even, it doesn't matter, what you do. If you've never done something for, ever, then the first time you do it, you're gonna look weird. That's how it works. Until the body, until the brain, until the nervous system, until the muscular system starts to learn and understand how to do all this in a more proficient, skilled, and coordinated pattern. Okay, so that's motor control. Okay, so there's a concept that I want you guys to start understanding. This is Newell's model, developed by Carl Newell, one of the fathers of kinesiology. But this concept, and you can see here, this is Newell's model of constraints. In order to understand development, you have to start to understand these constraints, to understand the study of movement, you have to understand these constraints. And what he's saying is that there's three types of constraints. You can see that there's individual constraints, there's task constraints, and then there's environmental constraints. Okay. Now, within the individual constraints, there are two parts of that. One of them is functional, which is in reference to, one of them is structural, which is in reference to our body. How our body has developed in order to either allow or permit particular movement. Are the bones strong enough to uphold us, or to hold us up when we're trying to stand? Are our muscles strong enough in order to be able to move the bones in a coordinated pattern? So it's structural. Functional is our attitude towards that movement. So think about like the first time, like if you've ever jumped off a cliff, for example, you just didn't just jump off the cliff. I mean, the first time you kind of look down and just like, whoa, I don't know if I can do this. I don't have that confidence yet. But after you jump, a couple of times, you start to establish that confidence. And now you have no limitations or no restrictions on your ability to perform that movement. Okay. We do that with all movement. Again, going back to the infant, who's starting to walk for the first time, they can pull themselves up because structurally they can hold their body up. They can hold themselves upright, but they have to hold on to furniture or to a table, to a small table. And whenever they start to walk, they just don't have the confidence just to start walking. They have to build that confidence by holding on to the table until they start to realize, oh, I can do this on my own. I don't need a table anymore. I don't need to hold on. I can just do this with my own 2 feet. Okay, so that's structural versus functional. The task constraints are the constraints that are, so you can see the individual constraints. The task constraints are the goal of the actual movement. Okay, so you can see some pictures here of different movements that that are being accomplished. Like, okay, so they're normal movements being accomplished abnormally. That's because of the variations of the task. So for example, you see the first picture, quarterback throwing a pass. Now, ideally, what's the most ideal situation is to be able just to stand upright and feel no pressure, have no one run at you, perfect conditions, and just throw the ball normally, right? That's the task. Throw the ball. Okay? Well, now, in this picture, you can see there's a defense. There's people trying to get him down. Perhaps he had to move his footwork. But in all actuality, what's the task? Throw the ball. It's still throw the ball. But this proficient athlete, or in this case, a proficient athlete, understands his body to the point where he can still accomplish the task even though the task has changed. That's a task constraint. Same thing with a diving catch. What's the task? Catch the ball. It's simple, but there's different ways you can catch a ball. So it's by constant training and practicing different ways to catch the ball, then you can start to train your body onto how to catch a ball even in the most abnormal situations, like having to stretch for it just like he is in midair. The bottom picture, same thing. And here's Kobe Bryant shooting. It looks like either a game-winning or a quarter-ending shot. Let's call it a game-winning shot. I mean, there's only 0.4 seconds left. What's the task? You get the ball in the hole, right? Get the ball in the hoop. There's tons of different ways to shoot a basket and get the ball in the hole. This case, he's having to do so with a man with an arm-stretched arm. It looks like Dwayne Wade with a far-stretched arm, and he is having to overcome that barrier, that physical barrier, and he's having to do it within the time strength, and he looks like he's off balance. Not the ideal situation, but he's done it for so long. He's become so proficient at shooting that his body is able to do it in really any situation, because they just have that self-awareness. All right, so those are the task constraints. Environmental constraints are just characteristics of the space where the movement occurs. So I'm sure you can think of like poor weather. Here's rain and mud. Here's snow. Trying to kick a field goal in the snow. It's what's the task? Kick the field goal. But whenever you have the environmental constraint of, whenever I step, I slip, or whenever I'm trying to run and every time I step, I slip, I got to run, you change the way you run in order to accomplish the same task, that's an environmental constraint. Even like walking through a dark tunnel, are we allowed to walk normally in a dark tunnel? Absolutely. But the environment causes us to lose confidence. Therefore, with a loss of confidence, we change the way we walk. We don't walk normally. We walk with caution, shorter steps, slower. It's the same task. You're walking through the tunnel, but you just have to change the way you do it. All right, that's an environmental constraint. Okay, So that, so going back to the model of constraints, Newell's model of constraints, that's what the 3 points are referring to, and we'll talk a lot about this over the next couple of chapters, and especially in terms of movement development. Like, you take the example of a 5-year-old trying to shoot a basket, opposed to a college athlete, a college basketball player who shoots a basket, like a jump shot. I should say a jump shot. The 5-year-old shoots a jump shot from the hip, right? He has to get real low, bring the ball down to his hip, and really push from his hip all the way through his range of motion. Whereas the college basketball player, in order to shoot a jump shot, they just stand up right from right here and just jump and shoot from right there, right? That's what they're capable of doing. So we'll look at how the movement is affected by all of these different constraints. Okay, so we'll start talking about that in chapter 2. Okay, well, that completes this particular chapter. This was just an intro to the course, Fundamental Concepts. I'm sorry to get this video to you so late in the week. I want to try to get videos in so that you could have them on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So I'll do my best. This week I was a little distracted with trying to get my home on the market. And trying to prepare, to show and to let people come see the house. So next week I should have a lot more free time to complete these videos. So I'll get those to you on time. Please remember to complete the syllabus assignment tonight. That's Friday, and our student video introduction, which is due on Sunday. And please let me know if you have any questions. I'll talk to you soon.